talk, Johnny?
It's been 25 years since gamers first entered the 32-bit haunted hallways of Spencer Mansion in the iconic Resident Evil. And to celebrate this auspicious event, I wanted to take a look back at the franchise's first foray into Hollywood with 2002's aptly named Resident Evil. But, like with my Ghostbusters video, which if you haven't watched already, please do so, I wanted to begin with a little backstory. The road to getting Resident Evil off the PS1 and onto cinema screens wasn't easy. Capcom sold the rights to the game in late 1996 to German film studio Constantin Film, who hired Halloween 4's Alan McElroy to write the script. However, with the release of Resident Evil 2 in 1998, Constantin became anxious over McElroy's Resident Evil 1 focused script, and he was later removed from the project. In his place stepped the godfather of the undead himself, George Romero. With an iconic series of zombie movies under his belt, and after having directed the TV commercial for Resident Evil 2, Romero was brought on board as writer and director for the movie in 1998. Romero's script would contain several differences from the source material, including taking franchise icon Chris Redfield and making him a civilian ranch owner and not a member of the Star's Alpha team. Romero's script would go through several drafts before he threw in the towel. The reasons for Romero's exit were due to Constantin's worries over his script leaning on the heavy side of an R rating, with scenes depicting various Stars members being torn from limb to limb by the undead. As a German film company, Constantin were concerned with the country's censorship of R-rated films. With Romero struggling to compromise on his ideas, he departed in 1999, leaving Constantin exhausted and nearing giving up on the film altogether. Then came along the lesser of the Paul Andersons, W.S.
No, fantastic. That was fantastic. That was great. Great action there. Terrific. Very good.
Anderson came into the picture after having previously written scripts for Constantine. As a fan of the game, Anderson produced a script called Undead, but at the time it had no relation to Resident Evil, so didn't feature any references to the game. This was due to Constantine being on the verge of ditching the project entirely, and thus allowing Anderson to sell the script to another studio as an unrelated zombie movie. But after reading his script, Constantine were happy to greenlight the project, with Anderson as the sole writer and director. With this, Anderson amended his Undead script to feature references to the game and have it sit within the Resident Evil universe. The film was shot in Germany on a budget of $33 million, which even for the early noughties was a very low budget. For context, Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man was released the same year as Resident Evil, and it had a budget of $139 million. Obviously it's a bigger movie, but that's still quite the difference. The reason for Constantine's pitiful budget was due to already having spent a sizable amount of money on the previous writer's scripts, so when Anderson came along, they were insistent on keeping the bill as low as possible. And so after 6 years, 3 writers, 2 directors, and 6 video game releases, the first Resident Evil movie was finally released in 2002. Set in a secretive underground lab called the Hive, a mysterious figure steals a collection of vials containing a mix of blue and green liquids. Kept concealed from the audience, the mysterious character puts all but one of the vials into a briefcase and tosses the remaining blue vial into the lab before making his escape. Once the contents of the blue vial enter into the lab's air conditioning, the Hive's AI system, called the Red Queen, works to maintain the outbreak by sealing off the exits and gassing the employees to death. Hours later, Mila Jovovich awakens after having fallen in the shower. Suffering from amnesia, Mila's Alice wanders through the mansion before being accosted by Eric Mabius's Matt, but then a group of mercenaries crash into the mansion and order Alice to give them a report. Due to her amnesia, she fails to do so, leading the mercenaries to take her and Matt with them to the Hive, discovering James Purfoy's Spence, also suffering with amnesia, en route. Their mission? To find out why the Red Queen went homicidal and shut her down before the Hive is sealed shut for good. But in doing so, unlocks the doors within the Hive, revealing the horrifying reason behind the AI's actions. Now with less than 3 hours to escape before the Hive is sealed shut for good, Alice, Matt and Spence work with the mercenaries, led by Michelle Rodriguez's Rain, to find a way out while attempting to avoid the hordes of T-virus infected zombies and a mutated monster called the Licker.
You're all going to die down here.
In concept, the premise for the movie is strong. It takes the basics from the first game and acts as an almost prequel to the events of the PS1 classic. In fact, according to Anderson in an interview, he claimed that was the intention of his script, to lead into the mansion incident in a potential sequel. However, having read his official draft of the script, the ending, although different from what was actually shot, doesn't tie into the first game at all. Instead, it shows both Alice and Matt waking up in the Umbrella facility months later, only to discover the entire country has been infected. I'd agree that outside of the core premise, the film effectively fails in almost all areas of its script. None of the characters feel like real people, despite attempts to give each of the mercenaries some form of personality and relationship between one another. Alice and Spence fall into the trope of amnesia removed my personality, which to me is an abhorrently overused mechanic to tell a fish out of water story with your main character, and in this case hide the main antagonist in plain sight. It's a trope I dislike in media because amnesia, especially short-term memory loss, does not remove one's personality. Spence goes from practically charming and cowardly to moustache-twirling Bond villain in the blink of an eye after remembering he released the virus all along. It's hackneyed and lazy writing that's disguised by the authors of these kinds of scripts as clever. Most of the mercenaries get 0 lines, and the actors in those roles fail to not look robotic in their very few scenes. I have a particular affection for the one guy standing beside Colin Salmon during the laser corridor scene, who literally looks like he's doing an impression of a robot before having his fingers cut off by the Red Queen. But what's worse is how Milla Jovovich gives us absolutely nothing in her protagonist. With the amnesia trope in full effect, you'd be forgiven for thinking that's why she's particularly stiff in the first movie, but she continues to fashion an IKEA cupboard with her performance throughout the franchise. And given her natural charisma off-screen, her performances in films such as Zoolander, Dazed and Confused, and The Fifth Element, blame can only be laid upon her husband for how badly her character is written. And it's such a shame. Of the two leads, Michelle Rodriguez is the standout by far. She's believable as a hardened soldier, and genuinely sells in the scene where she's goading Alice into killing her for the sake of the remaining survivors' escape. Now, I'm not saying her performance is more than what it is, but she's definitely the best in this ensemble, and I'd much prefer to have had her take the lead throughout the franchise. Alongside the poorly written characters are a number of lazy mechanics Anderson has become all too affiliated with. Things such as relying on map transitions between scenes. It's a simple way of lazily writing yourself out of a corner. The visual representation of a throwaway line, as it were. This is something he's used throughout the Resident Evil series, and his dreadful take on Alien vs Predator. And if you pay attention, especially in the first Resident Evil movie, it's used to distract the audience from characters seeming to go from one end of the skyscraper-sized underground lab to another in a moment's notice, all the while dodging the hordes of zombies we've been told are blocking the doors. And I know this may seem nitpicky for a film like Resident Evil, but it's something that goes a long way into revealing just how lazy Anderson is with his scripts. Of course, the argument for the lack of budget is there, but when the film genuinely starts off strong, it feels like Anderson got to the point of setting up the first zombie set piece and then said, fuck it, map transitions and poorly edited set pieces for the remaining 45 minutes. Along with this, the zombies seem to disappear and reappear throughout the movie. The two scenes that stand out are the Dining Hall B and Red Queen chamber scenes, where in the former, after JD has been torn to shreds in true Romero fashion, the team are surrounded by the infected, and yet when we cut back to Alice and Matt, trudging between the BOW containers, they're alone, and not a single zombie's in sight. Matt even has enough space to ditch Alice in order to go wandering the hive looking for his sister. And in the latter, Matt and Alice run back to the Red Queen's chamber via one of those lazy map transitions I mentioned, with the zombies now behind them. But when Rain, Kaplan and Spence first entered that chamber at the start of the scene, the zombies were banging on both the doors.
When you cut the power, you unlock the doors. You let them out.
Then there's the use of the game's mutant infected. Both the dogs and the liquor are lazily used in this movie. Both creatures have an iconic introduction in the games that are sorely missed here. In RE1, the dogs kill STAR's Alpha Team member Joseph, before chasing the remaining members into the mansion, later to have one burst through the east hallway window and chase the player to the door. These moments are even scarier in the GameCube remake, with lingering shots of Joseph's body cam as he pathetically fires his gun into the air while the undeterred Cerberuses chomp away at him, while Jill Valentine looks on in horror. So by comparison, to see Alice cornered by 8 of them and make 7 perfect headshots, all of which we don't see, before performing a flying kick on the last one, is an absolute waste of a potentially good sequence. What could have been a tense set piece of Alice evading the horde of infected Dobermans is a short and clunkily edited sequence. In fact, when rereading Anderson's original script for the film, the scene was originally intended to see Alice run and seek shelter in one of the cages while being charged at by the first dog, only then to discover the cage she's in isn't empty and she has to battle her way out while being attacked by the dog who's in the cage with her. All of this takes place while the first dog rips at the cage door. It's a scene that reads like a much more intense build-up than what we saw in the final movie. As for the liquor, where do you begin? In the original Resident Evil 2, the liquor is introduced after the player discovers a beheaded corpse in the corridor of RPD. The camera pans up slowly to reveal the creature crawling on the ceiling. With its shallow breathing, drawl, and overlong tongue and claws, the introduction of the liquor was immediately terrifying, tense, and precise in execution. Yet in the film, the liquor is teased throughout. We see it escape from the container in Diner Hall B, then we watch as it crawls the walls of the sewers, all before finally stepping into the light of the train station ceiling and killing the now villainous Spence, all before mutating into a totally different monster. And therein lies the issue with Anderson's treatment of the liquor. By the time the film tries to reenact the ceiling introduction from RE2, the suspense is completely lost, because we've seen him running around the hive for the last hour. And with Spence now being revealed to be the main antagonist of the movie, the audience feels no sympathy for him being the liquor's first victim. And from that point on, the movie ditches any attempt of making this monster similar to its video game counterpart in every way except for its large tongue, only for that to act as its Achilles heel in the final showdown with Alice and Matt. Each set piece feels rushed, and as mentioned previously, once the zombies are revealed, it's as though Anderson throws in the towel and stops bothering to build any suspense or maintain the atmosphere he developed in the initial build-up. Instead, the movie becomes a slapdash attempt at Matrix-inspired fight sequences and cheap thrills for the fans. This was a time before the term fanservice was coined, but in retrospect that's exactly how this feels. Perhaps due to budgetary restraints, rewrites of Anderson's superior initial script, or just laziness on Anderson's part, precisely at the halfway mark the film plunges into lackluster territory. And that for me is Resident Evil's biggest crime, the sense of promise in the first half. And as this is a video titled In Defense Of, it's time I address this. The setup for the film is genuinely interesting and has plenty of things working in its favour. The idea of the hive being this large underground habitat for its workers, where due to the secrecy of their work for Umbrella, they both live and work there, and are comforted in their subterranean confines by this elusive metropolis backdrop beyond their window, is so interesting that that alone could have made for a great movie.
Makes it easier to work underground, thinking there's a view.
It's a welcome departure from the game, as the lab in the first game is minute by comparison, with the scientists living in the mansion above. It's a genuinely intriguing departure from the source material that I've always praised Anderson for whenever revisiting this film. Is it wholly original? No, but it's interesting, and clearly something Anderson put some effort into. Alongside this, the concept for the Red Queen is equally as interesting. Sure, her actions in the laser corridor, which I'm coming to, and with the poor workers in the elevators are somewhat sadistic. But at the start of the movie, her actions, elevator aside, are arguably correct. The majority of the hive's inhabitants are simply put to sleep in order to contain them. You could argue it's a sign of empathy from the AI, opting to allow them to die painlessly in their sleep, then live through the infection stages of the T-virus. Not forgetting that it's the mercenaries who unleash the infected after Kaplan arrogantly, and somewhat understandably, ignores her implorations to keep the door shut and her system running, this being the idea that she's not the villain after all. But sadly, Anderson's intentions for the Red Queen, our perception of her actions, and the mystery surrounding them are lost in execution. Because of his wanting to have his cake and eat it with the savage death scene in the elevator during the Red Queen's lockdown, and the opening sequence showing Spence, mysterious figure, unleashing the virus, the audience is already aware of why she's locking everyone in and killing them, so we're fully aware of Kaplan's error in shutting her down. A simple re-edit of the opening sequence and an air of mystery around her actions without actually seeing the virus unleashed would have had arguably made for a better first act for the film. Instead, Anderson, as is his method, only half commits to the few good ideas that he has. But while I'm here to defend this movie, I'll sum up some other elements I genuinely enjoy and think work for this adaptation. I've alluded to it enough, but now it's finally time to address the corridor scene. It's lackluster, silly, and the Red Queen's actions are savage in the sequence, but my god is it a fun scene. As an over-analytical critic, I can't help but question why the Umbrella Corp would build such a defence mechanism for the Hive's AI. A locked door would have sufficed. But I guess, being the corporation that's responsible for creating a zombie plague, lickers, and various other BOWs, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. However, the scene does lose its edge when you realise all Colin Salmon had to do was take 2 steps back and he'd be perfectly safe. Next time you watch Resident Evil, take note of the metal panels and the concrete wall just beyond the doorway into the corridor. The lasers are only active in the mirrored space, so Salmon could have simply edged back towards the doorway and been safely out of reach. But all that aside, it's still an incredibly fun popcorn moment and iconic within this film series. One additional thing about the corridor scene that I enjoy is how the bodies have disappeared when the team return to the chamber after the dining hall set piece, with Kaplan announcing,
"Where are the bodies? Where did they go?"
It's just a nice touch that alludes to the Red Queen having potentially disposed of the evidence, or a nod by Anderson to how corpses seem to disappear in the games from time to time. Either way, I've always liked the intrigue behind the corpses of Salmon and his team vanishing after the team have left. Outside of the initial concept for the Hive, the Red Queen, and the ridiculous corridor scene, I've always enjoyed the introduction of the zombies in this film. The scene in Dining Hall B is a page straight out of the zombie movie handbook, having Rain stumble upon a lone Z and mistaking her for a survivor before it attacks and bites her is a strong reveal. That's even better when JD discovers that the body's mysteriously vanished despite both he and Rain pumping it full of bullets seconds before. After that, the sound cue of what's revealed to be an axe being dragged along the floor by the lab tech we saw earlier in the film, trying to smash the reinforced glass during the lockdown, complete with his broken foot, is a genuinely brilliant moment. Again, I come to this idea of the potential this movie had to be honestly great, if only Anderson continued making an effort after this point. Although the Dining Hall B sequence turns into a haphazardly shot set piece of out-of-time reactions from stunt performers to being shot, and far too many close-ups of machine guns going off like gun pornography, I have to say I unironically love the entire scene. In terms of the zombies, it's become a trait in modern media to make the undead look as unrelated to their past humanity as possible. Being completely subjective for a minute, I have to say I really dislike the zombies in The Walking Dead, the later Resident Evil movies, and Zack Snyder's dreadful remake of the iconic Dawn of the Dead. Zombie movies are inherently seeded in B-movie territory. The low-budget grunginess of taking some extras, giving them dirty clothes and a few spots of blood on their face, and having them act like rigor mortis has just kicked in, is the key to a great zombie film. The whole basis for the use of zombies in early cinema was a cheap way of making horror movies on a budget. Simply point the camera with some well-lit shots of people in the shadows behaving inhumanely, and you've got yourself a terrifying zombie movie. Then Romero came along and added the themes of humanity and cultural politics to his representation of the undead, and the modern zombie was born. But these days, the excessive makeup and CG wounds on the undead lose that certain schlocky charm that the subgenre was born from. And although I'm sure Anderson would have had triple the CG shots of half-missing faces if he had the budget, I really like how the zombies are portrayed in Resident Evil. Both in look and in performance, they are the archetypal undead akin to the best work of Romero, and it's something that I think really works in this film. And on that note, the low-budget grunginess is all over this film. From the use of recycled sets, the dim lighting to hide the seams, the claustrophobic cinematography, and the largely unknown cast outside of Jovovich, Rodriguez, Salmon and Mabius, along with the minimalist zombie makeup, the first Resident Evil feels like an 80s B-movie fighting to be a modern one, and I think it works in the film's favour. And although I enjoy scenes like the laser corridor, imagine if Anderson had the budget, we'd get an abundance of those kinds of lackluster tone-deaf set pieces throughout the movie instead. On a personal note, I genuinely love the industrial metal score by Marilyn Manson and Marco Beltrami. It's an acquired taste, and Manson was still clearly going through his Nine Inch Nails plagiarism phase, but it reminds me of the synth scores of old Carpenter movies, just with added percussion. From a writing perspective, outside of the awful dialogue I've already mentioned, it was interesting to go back and reread Anderson's original script for the film. One interesting idea that never made it to the final movie are the references to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Certain elements did remain in the final film. As we know, Mila's character is called Alice, the Red Queen is called the Red Queen, and there's also a blink and you miss it shot of a white rabbit being experimented on. But what I find fascinating is how this theme of Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole was dropped during production. It would have been unnecessary and possibly out of place in a Resident Evil film, but it could have been interesting to flesh it out through Alice's fish out of water journey of self-discovery. In the original script, Alice wanders through an elaborate maze once she's reawoken from the shower, and comes across a statue of the Mad Hatter before Matt appears and begins interrogating her. Alongside this, there are several references to Wonderland in regards to the Hive. The resemblance of the little girl as the Red Queen is more fleshed out, and there are more explicit shots of white rabbits being experimented on during the flashbacks. Along with this, there is a second AI called the White Queen, who works to stop the Red Queen's lockdown measures in the Hive at the start of the film. Also in the original script, JD survives for a lot longer, with Rain being the character who's dragged by the Horde after the doors unlocked in Dining Hall B. There's also a lot more dialogue between the mercenaries, akin to James Cameron's Aliens, with JD actually being more of a jerk than he is in the final film, even as going as far as to threaten to cut Matt's genitals off whilst he's interrogating him on the train down to the Hive. The entire scene in Dining Hall B with the introduction of the zombies is different. By this point we're more familiar with the mercenaries, of which there are more in the original draft, and the action plays out again like an initial encounter in Aliens. One major difference is how Alice is the first one to be attacked in the group. She's initially saved by Rain, and then she's attacked once again by the axe-carrying lab tech, all before Spence takes the axe from the zombie and impales him on the liquor container. The entire sequence in Dining Hall B reads so much better on the page, with more gore, more empathy for the mercenaries as we've come to get to know them during the film, and the fear that any one of these characters could be killed. But the biggest standout in the original script for me is just how awful the dialogue was. As an example, at the end of her fight against the zombie dogs, Alice looks down at her hands and says to herself, "Damn, I'm a tough bitch." But it's not uncommon for a script to start with god-awful dialogue. It tends to improve with subsequent drafts and interpretation by the cast during rehearsals on set. But in the case of Resident Evil, the original script read so much worse than what we got. And I'd never argued the dialogue in Resident Evil was good, but if they had stuck to what was written originally, it would have been so much worse. On the whole, the film is played straight, and aside from the liquor and the dogs being wasted, doesn't cheapen the brand it's adapting, but maybe that's why the film works, and also doesn't work. Being so far removed from the source material as a pseudo Lewis Carroll inspired generic undead flick plays both into the film's strengths and weaknesses, along with Anderson's lazy direction and writing beyond a decent high concept in the premise. In this initial outing, we get no video game characters whatsoever. No Chris Redfield, no Jill Valentine or Albert Wesker. The mercenaries aren't called STARS or UBCS, but instead are lazily called Sanitation.
Sanitation?
And the Umbrella Corporation appears as nothing more than logos on screens and in the dialogue. It's enough to make fans of the original game angry that this isn't a straight adaptation of RE1. But when you look at how shamefully used the video game characters and elements are in the rest of the series, I'm glad that Anderson kept his distance in this first movie. Throughout the sequels, the use of video game characters and scenes are used like carrots dangling from a stick. Fan service at its worst. Villains like the Axeman from Resident Evil 5 somehow inexplicably makes his way from the African plains to a bathroom in an LA prison in one of the series' most awfully shot and edited set pieces. The same goes for Wesker and the cosplay looking cameos from Leon Kennedy and Barry Burton in Resident Evil Retribution. They're laughable, and the fight between Alice and the Ouroboros infected Jill Valentine is absolutely hideous to watch, despite how perfect Sienna Gilroy was in the role of Jill. I think it's safe to argue that despite the lack of game references, a lower budget, and restrictions by Constantine, the first film is undoubtedly the best in the series. Is it objectively a good film?
No.
It's awful, but I think it has a genuine B-movie charm akin to the Carpenter and Romero films of the 80s, with a genuinely interesting premise that is shamefully underdeveloped. But it's a fun, schlocky attempt at a video game adaptation that I wholly enjoy watching some 19 years on. I'm not too knowledgeable of every other video game adaptation out there, but of the ones that I've seen / endured, this is certainly my favourite. With a reboot scheduled for release later this year, I'm interested to see how they tackle it this time around. From what's been discussed in the media, the reboot will be a mesh of both RE1 and 2, and with that I already feel somewhat sceptical. Why not tell each story individually? What is Constantine's issue with adapting this first game? I fear this reboot will be a cluttered mess with the action taking place between both the mansion and the RPD unnecessarily. It all has a whiff of an impatient studio desperate to get the franchise back up and running without putting the actual work in. Have they learnt nothing from Warner Brothers' treatment of the DCEU? But I guess we'll soon see. As for me, I'll happily play the games and watch the first movie unironically enjoying every last awful bit of it. So until next time, thanks for watching. Thanks again for watching my defense of Resident Evil. I wasn't lying when I said I genuinely enjoy this film. It's terrible and it's full of wasted potential from Anderson's original concept, but it was released when I was a 15-year-old metalhead in love with the video games, and it ticked all of those boxes for me. So it's hard to separate the subjective from the objective here, but as you can tell, I'm not afraid to tear a film apart, regardless of how much I enjoy it. As with my Ghostbusters video, the backdrop supporting this essay is a piece of artwork by myself. I've opted to start producing animations of my artwork as the backdrop, rather than a time-lapse like I did for Ghostbusters, as not only does it look better, but my Mac is getting so old now that it struggles to capture my screen while I illustrate. But let me know in the comments if you prefer the time-lapses like I did for Ghostbusters, or the animation like I've done for here. And as with my Ghostbusters artwork, this poster is for sale in my store, and is available in a number of sizes. The link is in the description below if you do fancy supporting the channel and my artwork. It genuinely means a lot. And with that, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much once again for indulging this new channel while I work to find my voice on this platform and improve my output. Happy 25th anniversary Resident Evil, and I'll see you all next time.